Hey everyone, it's Natalie, also known as Knitty Natty, and this is the Sweetheart Sock. It actually comes out today, so I will have the link to the pattern down below. You may be wondering, why is it inside out? Because we are talking about knitting over ends in this video. Every single one of these ends, except for your cast on and your bind off, are all knit over, so that in this pattern, the only thing you have to do is snip. I would venture to say that if you're anything like the average knitter, that you don't like weaving in ends. I know some people do, but I use this method on almost every project when I change colors or join a new ball of yarn, and it is seriously the best. I have a previous video on how to do this technique, but this one is going to beef things up a bit because we're talking about 4 different times where this would be a needed technique. The first is, let's go right up here to this pink. When you are cutting an old color and you're going to knit over it. So when you're working with 2 colors, you cut one and you knit over it. The second is when you're joining in a brand new color and how to knit over that end. And then this one is really cool. When you are cutting a color and joining a new color and you have 2 ends, there's 2 different ways to do it. So first we're going to talk about when we're cutting an old color, second we'll talk about joining a new color, and then third and fourth we'll talk about how to deal with 2 different ends. Let's start with what to do when we are cutting one color and continuing with the other. So I have just been working with this mint green and this white color. I am now done with the mint green and I'm about to do a whole round in white. So since I've just finished with the mint green, it's time for me to break my yarn. Just like any other method, I'm gonna leave a tail that is, 8 inches long, and I'm just gonna go ahead and break that, or you can use scissors, whatever your preferred method is. Okay, so here's how we're going to get set up. I'm going to pick up the white yarn, which is my working yarn, in my right hand because I am an English right-handed knitter. I'm going to pick up the mint green yarn in my left hand like I'm going to continental knit with it. If you're a two-handed colorwork knitter, this is going to feel really comfortable. If you're not, you may want to practice with this a little bit. So let's pick up the sock here so we can actually get to knitting. Okay, I always like to put my needle into my stitch first before I pick up my yarn. I don't know why. Okay, so let me grab my white yarn in my right hand, that's my working yarn, and then the green I am getting into my left hand. So I'm set up like I'm gonna do color work. Oh, and by the way, I do have a video on how I do color work that I posted just before this, so I'll make sure to link that too. All right, so here's what we got going on. We already have our contrast color, our cut color, coming over the top of the working yarn. That's great because that means when I use the working yarn, it's going to catch. So that is just perfect. We love that. So I'm gonna go ahead and just knit 1 stitch in my main color yarn. Okay, now here's the exciting part. Here's where we're actually going to work over this green end that's here in my left hand. Ready? Go into the stitch with your needle, and then you're going to throw this green yarn, your cut yarn, backwards over the top of your needle like so, okay? So it's backwards from how you would knit it. You go from the back over the top of your needle. Okay, just hold it there. Now you're gonna take your working yarn and you're going to knit like normal. You're gonna wrap that stitch and pull through. Now watch as when I pull through, I'm not pulling through the green yarn. The green yarn's still just laying on the top like so. Slide my stitch off. And you may be wondering, did that even do anything? It did. What it did is it made my green yarn once again go on top of my white yarn. And I should be saying my cut yarn go on top of my working yarn. So when I knit this next stitch, just regular, it's going to catch that yarn. Okay, if you're like, wait, what? Stick with me for a couple more times because it does take a second for this to really make sense, and then you're gonna be blown away. Okay, I just did a regular stitch, which means I need to do one of my little catchy stitches next. So needle goes into the stitch, cut yarn comes opposite way of normal over the top of the needle, just so it's there. Then I'm going to wrap my needle with my working yarn and pull through. I'm not pulling through anything but the working yarn and slide off. And again, that's changed the way that these yarns are so that my working yarn is now going to catch my contrast color. Now I can do a regular stitch. So we alternate like this. We do a stitch where we catch, we do a regular stitch, and so on. So I'm going to speed it up just a little bit. I'm going to go into my stitch, throw that over, knit like normal. Then I'm going to knit one stitch just totally normal. Okay? I'm going to do a catch stitch where I throw it over, wrap around, pull through, and then another just regular stitch. All the while, my working yarn is going over the needle for one stitch, staying out of the way for the next. And look at what it's doing here. What this has done is every other stitch, it's catching, trapping my cut yarn so that it stays right here and gets woven in as I go. I'm going to bring this up to full speed, and then I will meet you back at our next task, which is to join in a new yarn. If you're a little bit like wary of this, please, I beg you, give it a try. It's going to change your life. And if you're a continental knitter, would you consider maybe just for, oh, by the way, you want to do this for like, I don't know, a couple inches. And fingering weight yarn, I usually do like 15 stitches, and that's what I work with most of the time. But if you have a larger yarn, you may do like 10 stitches or something. But if you are a continental knitter, would you consider for just these 15 stitches swapping the hand that you use to knit with so that you can weave in your ends nice and fast? Now we're met with our next task, which is when we need to join in a new yarn and knit over that end. The concept is pretty much the same, but I have a little bit of a tip that kind of helps things not to be gappy or anything. So I'm still continuing with my white yarn, but I'm going to be joining in this blue yarn. And for this sock in particular, I have plain rows in between all the color work so that you can knit over all of your ends intentionally, because again, I do not like to weave in my ends. Okay, so let's talk about how to add in a new color and knit over it. This is best done on a row where you're just knitting with one color. This row, I'm going to be just knitting with blue. Go ahead and insert your needle into the stitch. This is how I like to join yarn, no matter what I'm doing, like if I'm just joining a new ball of yarn. Okay, what I will do is I have the tail end in my right hand and the end from the ball in my left hand. Okay, so I'm kind of like holding it like so, tail, ball. And I've already got my needle into the stitch. I always start with my needle into the stitch. I just think that's easier. Okay, leave a tail, and I'm holding the yarn with my left hand, and I'm just going to loop things over. Alternatively, you could like create a loop with your hand and then just like loop it onto the needle and pull it through, okay? So first stitch done, great. Now here's the trick. I want my new yarn to come underneath my old yarn just when I start, just for the first row, because that will close any gap that I have. So let me find the tail, because I want the tail to go over to the left and get out of the way. And then here's my working yarn. I did only pick the most confusing color since it's the same as my cord. Okay, but anyway, I'm going to bring my new color underneath my old color, which is the white, so that they have crossed right here. So they've crisscrossed, you can see my working yarn is now coming from underneath the old color, which is white. The tail just needs to get out of the way. Working yarn is coming underneath. When I knit my next stitch, it's going to pull that up. Don't worry about there being a gap with your old yarn, because when you use your old yarn again, you can pull that closed, okay? So that's the first tip when you're adding a new color, is to do this little crisscross deal here. Okay, so now we're gonna do exactly what we did when we cut an old color, which is knit over our end. I've already knit one stitch here. I've got the tail in my left hand. I've got the working yarn from the ball here in my right hand, and I am ready to start knitting over this end. So since we just had a regular stitch, I'm gonna go ahead and throw that tail yarn, remember it's backwards over, and then knit regularly with my working yarn. Now I can do a regular stitch because I'm going to alternate every other one, and I continue going just like before. I don't want to make this tutorial like the longest tutorial you've ever watched in your life. So if you want to see exactly how we do this knitting over ends technique, just go back to that very first color, the green, and watch that again. So here we go. I'm just going full speed. Again, I'm going to do about 15 stitches the whole time. My new blue end is getting woven right in. Don't worry about this, because when you go to knit the next row, you can pull that close. So don't worry about that. All right, the next technique that we have, where were we? Is my yarn trapped? Yes. If you don't know where you are, you can check. Is your tail yarn, your cut yarn, about to get trapped? Yes, it is. That's a regular stitch. Okay, I'm getting off topic here. Next up, 3 and 4, options 3 and 4 is going to be, what do you do when you're cutting 2 yarns and you have 2 ends? There's actually 2 different ways that you can knit over them, so I will show you those next. We have jumped ahead here in our sock. We're past the color work, past the heel, and we're now on to this section where we're gonna have 2 ends. So not just in the sweetheart socks, but in many different patterns, there might be times where you have 2 different ends at the same time. And there are 2 ways we can deal with that. And these 2 ways have their benefits, like pros and cons. So the first way that we can deal with it is we can actually knit over both ends at the same time. A con for this, as you can see in this very textured section right here on my other sock, is that this can affect the right side of the sock a lot. Now this sock still isn't blocked, so it will get a little bit better, but it definitely affects the way that these stripes look. Now, if you look ahead here, I've got a much smoother look. This is from the second method, where you introduce the new color before you're done knitting the old color and knit over it, and then you knit over the second end here. So I'm just going to flip it inside out to show you what that looks like on the inside, and then I'll show you both methods. If you're not doing a bunch of ends in a row, it's probably okay to do the first method, which is a little easier to just knit over both ends. Which way do I want to have this? But if you have a bunch of like small stripes, these are 2 row stripes in a row, you might want to do the second method. So you can see here our first method where I've knit over 2 ends at a time. So they're just knit over together, like pink and orange is together, orange and yellow are together, and so on. So this would happen, you'd get 2 ends anytime you cut an old color and join a new color, or let's say you're just joining in a new ball, you're knitting the same color, but you're joining in a new ball. And then you can see I tried out where I only have 1 end here. I've only knit over 1 end. That's because I joined in the other one over here. So I joined in the new color before I started knitting with the new color, and that separates things. So you're only knitting over 1 end at a time. So let me show you the first method, which I think is a tiny bit easier, which is to knit over both colors at once. So I've just finished here with my pink. I'm totally done knitting my pink, so I'm going to break my yarn. Oh my gosh, I put on so much lotion before I did this. I don't know if I can break the yarn. No worries. That's what scissors are for. All right, leave a tail, just like before. And then now I'm gonna join in my orange next. And of course I will have a tail from joining in this new yarn. So again, this could be like, they could be the same color and you're just ran out of yarn from one ball, you're joining in the next, whatever this is. Anytime you have two ends, you can use this method. Super easy. I'm gonna get everything ready to knit. I'm gonna join in my orange, just like I showed before, where I just like to basically take a length long enough for a tail and pull that over my needle and knit my first stitch. Now, here's where I do that same thing where I cross things over like before. So I'm going to take my pink end, which is my old end, and I'm going to bring old over new. I'm going to bring pink over my orange working yarn. So this is my orange yarn that's coming from the ball, my working yarn. I'm going to take my old pink end over my working yarn like this, and my new orange end, same thing, both over. But I get that crisscross of the old end, old color and new color right here to close that gap, okay? So now I've got two ends in my left hand ready to knit. So for the first stitch, because we're already like in a position where we're trapping that, I'm just gonna knit. Okay, it's the second stitch, but the first where I'm trapping things, right? Okay, second stitch, first where I'm trapping, I'm just gonna knit it regularly because we already have a lot going on. But then as I go into the second stitch, I'm gonna start that same method that we've done before. However, pay close attention because you will have quite a lot of a gap. So you really wanna pull, wants to focus on the cord. You really want to pull on your old color there and close that gap up when you do this next one. See how that just gave me so much extra pink yarn when I closed that gap? So I'm going to readjust here. Bring those two ends over, just treating them like they're one, and knit around them, and then knit the next one. But again, I'm just going to pull and close that gap again, because it's going to take a second before I really get that gap closed up. There we go. Okay, so now I can just continue on, just like before, where you trap once, throw them over once, knit them regularly once, throw them over, knit regularly. And you just carry on holding these two ends together. The con is that this can be pretty thick, so it can affect the way that your knitting looks. So if you're having to do a bunch of ends in a row, you may not want to use this method. So let me show you the other one next. This final method of knitting over two ends is my preferred method, but it does take some forethought. And there is a con to this one. I used this method when I was joining in my pink yarn. I don't know if you can see, you can just barely see my pink yarn through the white yarn. So the con of this method is that because we're going to join in our new color before we actually start knitting it, so I'm about to join in my yellow while I'm still knitting on my orange, it can show through a little bit more. So that is a con of this method. I guess alternatively, there's a third way you could do this where you could just, when you get to those two ends here, you could just knit over one and then weave the other one in regularly, but let's be real, who wants to do that? We want to knit over our ends. All right, so let me show you this last method. Again, this one takes some forethought. I'm going from orange to yellow, so these are going to be my two ends. However, I'm not done knitting orange yet. I still have about 15 stitches remaining with my orange, but this is when I want to join in my next color. So I like to do 15 stitches on fingering weight, around 15 stitches, but you only need a couple of inches. So if that's fewer stitches, depending on the weight of your yarn, you can use your best judgment there. Okay, So I'm going to start knitting over my new color, yellow, before I even finish knitting my orange. That way I can knit over yellow all right here. And then when I break my orange, I can knit over orange as I continue around with yellow, my new color. So let's go ahead and start knitting over the new color here. Again, as always, I'm going to go into my stitch to start. I just like being set up. Now I'm going to get my new yarn and remove any dog hairs that are in it. Go ahead and get out a length of yarn. You actually don't need anything super long this time because we're going to start with the tail. So this time we want the tail aiming towards our right hand. So what I'm going to do is just take this tiny little tail and lay it across here. It doesn't need to be super long because this is not the part that we're knitting over. We're actually knitting over the working yarn. Okay, so just lay things across like this. That way, when I go to knit this stitch that I already have set up on my needle, it's going to trap my new color, okay? So I'm going to trap my new color. There we go. It's trapped now. And later, I will come back and I will trim this, okay? So don't worry about it right now. All right. So my new color is here in my left hand. My old color, or my current color rather, is in my right hand, and I can start doing my same deal. I'm going to start with throwing the yarn over and knitting it, and then knitting one stitch regularly. And I'm just going to carry on like this until I reach the end of my orange. Because remember, I'm still knitting with orange right now. I'm only knitting over the yellow. And as I broke in between, before I came back to show you the rest of this tutorial, and I remember I mentioned all the lotion on my hands, I realized that one of my hands has cracked, one of my fingers, and it's bleeding because winter in New York, you guys, so bad. So just ignore. Blood and white yarn does not mix. Okay, so I'm at my last stitch. I'm going to finish that up. And here we go. I have finished knitting my old color, my orange, and my new color. The end of my new color is already all trapped in here. Again, I'll come back and trim this. I like to do it after blocking though. Okay, so now this is super cool. We have new color already ready to work. And then the old color's right here. I'm done working with my orange, so again, I can break it, but we're gonna use scissors. Leave a tail. There we go. Okay. Let me turn around, get set up to work my next row here. Now I'm working with yellow. And since I've already knit over my yellow, my new color, it's already right here, completely ready for me to work because the tail of it's over there. Isn't that cool? So now as I work my yellow, I start my first round of actually knitting yellow. I am going to knit over the end, my old yarn that I just cut, okay? So when we start this out, always go into my stitch. Let's see how things are looking. It looks like to me, my old color, my orange, is going to be, if I place it in my left hand, is going to be sort of trapped. Oh, you know what? Let's switch those around. This first stitch doesn't matter so much, but there we go. Now my old color is going over my new color. Old orange is going over new yellow so that it kind of gets trapped. That first part doesn't matter too much. So let's just knit one stitch regularly. As we go to knit our second stitch, we're going to throw that old yarn over because now we're knitting over this end and knit it. Now, address the gap that you're going to have in between your needles and make sure to pull on your old end and close things up before you continue on, okay? There we go. So now I'm just going to knit over this end. And this is just my preferred method because it doesn't affect the stitches quite as much because you're only knitting over one end at a time. And it just works out super, super nicely. Thanks so much for watching this tutorial. I hope you got lots of tips for knitting over your ends and know that you never have to weave in an end again. I will have this saved under knitting playlist, or you can save it to your own playlist on YouTube so you will be able to easily find it and go back to it. And just as a reminder, this pattern, the Sweetheart Socks, come out today, February 1st, and I will have them linked down below.